Welcome to Jarber's Gospel Thoughts and more Old Testament. And today we continue talking about the story of Solomon. So we left Solomon having established himself. And in verse 25 of chapter 4 of 1 Kings, it says, "And Judah and Israel dwelt safely, every man under his vine, and every man and under his fig tree, from Dan even to Beersheba." So that's from the north to Beersheba, down the south, all the days of Solomon. So peace is established in the land. The rule of Solomon is established. There is peace. And now Solomon has to turn his wisdom and his fortunes and that stability and peace towards the next big project. Before starting on that, and before we continue the story of Solomon as he builds the temple and as he builds Israel as an empire, it's worth noting a couple of things about First Kings and Second Kings, because they are originally one book, the dealings of the kings of Israel. The whole theme is we have a united Israel, we have this prosperity, and we have David, whether it's Saul or David or Solomon, as we shall see, there is this cycle, there is this cycle of David, the cycle of Solomon, which starts with them doing okay, and then they fall into the trappings of power. They get power, they feel safe, and so they take their eyes off the ball. And then they start ignoring what's important, and then they fall into sin. And for Saul, he lost the kingdom, but David, because he has the promise of the Lord, we've seen how even though he kept the kingdom, he's lost his sons, most of them, he lost his family, and there was this tension in the land, and there was this intrigue. And now we get Solomon, and he starts his rule right. He has safety, he has wealth, he has fortune, but then later on we will see that the cycle will end with him falling, and then really the cycle for the rest of the books of Kings doesn't. Israel, there are a couple of rare occasions where Israel regains its strength and goes back to the Lord fully, but really it never recovers. And that is a lesson for all of us, I think. The lesson is we keep our eyes on the ball, that we do not get seduced by power when we have it. You don't need to be a king to have power. Power can come to you in a political position. Power can come to you in your work, in a corporation or an organization. Power can come to you just by the mere position of your position in the household as a patriarch or a father or a mother. You have lots of power, and we need to wield power very safely and be careful with it, because it can blind us to what really matters. So this is my little intro. This is the theme of the book of Kings, it seems. But let's get back to Solomon. So there is peace, and now in chapter 5 we are introduced to this Hiram of Tyre. We've seen that when David earlier established in 2 Samuel established his rule, he started communicating with Hiram of Tyre. Tyre is a city, it's rich, it has resources. Hiram is a name that means one of noble birth or one of nobility. That's what the name means. The root of it, har, it means hot or warm. But when you use it in this form, when you use this meter, we call it, to construct the name, it means someone of noble birth. So Hiram, king of Tyre, sent his servants unto Solomon, for he had heard that they had anointed him king in the room of his father, meaning Solomon. For Hiram was ever a lover of David. So Hiram sends his emissaries only after he makes sure that Solomon is the legitimate king that David wanted to be king, because he was ever a lover of David. He loved David, and so he's loyal to whoever David is loyal to. And in verse 3, Solomon basically tells the emissaries, sent to Solomon, saying, Thou knowest how that David my father could not build an house unto the name of the Lord his God for the wars which were about him on every side, until the Lord put them under the soles of his feet. But now the Lord my God hath given me rest on every side, so that there is neither adversary nor evil occurrent. And behold, I purpose to build an house unto the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord spake unto David my father, saying, Thy son whom I will set upon thy throne in thy room, he shall build a house, and house unto my name. So Solomon is determined to fulfill his father's commands to the letter, including building this house. Now, I haven't spoken about the tabernacle or the temple in previously when we were talking about the Israelites in the wilderness. So the temple was the center of Jewish life. It's the place where you offer sacrifices. And as you've read, there are different types of sacrifices offered in the temple. And so I'm going to talk about them briefly for a purpose for this lesson. But in the temple, you offer sin offerings and guilt offerings, and that's the first type of offerings. And that is something that you offer for sins against God and sins against others. So that's the difference between a sin offering and guilt offering. A guilt offering is one you offer for trespasses that you made against people. Sin offerings is trespasses against God. And in Judaism, there is the 613 mitzvot. These are the commandments of God, what you should do and you should not do. And so it determines whether your sin is against a man or is against God. And that sin, basically, you slaughter an animal, the priests eat a part of it, but you and your family and guests eat a part of it. And so this is something you give to the priest. Then there is the burnt offering. This is an offering that you burn on the altar. This is a sin of complete devotion. You just burn the whole thing. None of it stays. You burn the whole thing. And this is a sign of surrender to God. And then there is the grain and meal offering. Now, in ancient Israel, the higher you were in society, the bigger your sacrifice. That's why when we read about the sacrifices that Solomon offers in the temple, we'll hear about tens of thousands of oxen and sheep and cows and all of that. But if you're a lower person, you can offer grain, you can offer pigeons, you can offer the level of the offering decreases by your status in society as your status decreases or increases. So you can offer grain offerings, and usually the priest would take a part of that and burn it, and then the rest of it is shared. And then there is a peace offering, which you offer when you come back from a trip safely or when something good happens in your life. And this is a sacrifice that is waved before the altar. And the waving serves a function. It's before God. You're waved. You express thanks. And the waving is supposed to sort of shake off whatever sin or guilt you had, meaning you're clear of sin and guilt when you offer that. Like the sacrifice you're offering has to be perfect, without blemish, etc. So, why do I mention all of these? Because as the number of the people and the number of the Israelite population increases, now they are established, they are a big country, they are an empire, they rule over people. The number of sacrifices offered by the people, because it was a central part of Jewish life, is exceeding the capacity of the tabernacle, that tent, that tent that the Israelites used since the day of Moses. And so there is a need for a temple. David couldn't build it because, first of all, his rule wasn't established. As Solomon said, he had to fight many wars. The kingdom wasn't established. Now they have Jerusalem. Now there is peace, there is rest. So Solomon needs to build that. And he needs to build it to capacity, to basically be able to do everything that the Jewish population needed to do, but also serve the needs of other nations, as we will see in Solomon's prayer. So some of the terminology that will be used when you read it, of course, the Temple of Solomon and the Tabernacle. One important thing to know about them is that you couldn't do things on the cheap. You couldn't do things just haphazardly. The best had to be offered. The best had to be used to build this tabernacle and now the temple. And Solomon has to follow that. He has to use the best material, the best of everything to build the tabernacle. And it is also a sign of dedication that you're building this thing to the Lord, so it needs to be perfect in every way, including the material that is used. So the chapters that talk about the temple are very detailed, very elaborate about what gets built, what gets added. There is lots of moving parts to building the temple. And Solomon builds a temple in chapter 6. He builds a temple, and Hiram supplies him with all the material, and he has this agreement with Hiram that he also supplies Hiram with material, including food for the people who are participating in building the temple. So in verse 11 of chapter 5, we read about 20,000 measures of wheat for food to his household, and 20 measures of pure oil. Thus gave Solomon to Hiram year by year. And and the Lord gave Solomon wisdom, and he promised him, as he promised him, and there was peace between Hiram and Solomon, that they made a league together. So this is a trade agreement. This is an agreement, a contract between Hiram and Solomon. And Solomon used his peace to have that agreement with Hiram. So chapter 6 goes into all of these details about building the temples. It's very elaborate. It's always very hard for me to read it because I'm a visual person when it comes to these things, and I like to see it. There are books out there like the Rose Book of Charts, of Bible charts, that has visual illustrations of the Temple of Solomon as well as the tabernacle, and it helps you visualize and understand the parts of the pieces of the temple. But needless to say, it's full of symbolism. It symbolizes things, and I can't help but compare the symbolism of the in the ancient temples with what we see in temples today. So, for example, in the ancient temple, we had things like the Levites and the Levites checking you. There's a gate, and the Levites check you as you enter. So to make sure that your sacrifice is perfect. And when I think of our Temple Recommend interview process these days, you have the stake president, you have the bishop, who are basically inspecting you, inspecting your life, and causing you to inspect your own life before you enter the temple of the Lord, before you get one of those recommends that are needed to participate in temple ordinances. So there is that. There is, for example, the sea that they call it the sea in the Temple of Solomon, or the mikvah, or the pool where the priests have to wash themselves. Of course, they are doing a lot of slaughtering. This is the other thing about the temple. There is a lot of slaughtering and service being done by the Levites and by the priests. And so that service included blood, and they need to wash themselves continually of the blood of sacrifices. They are dealing with oils. They have to change it to make sure that the menorah in the Holy of Holies is burning all the time. So there is a lot of moving pieces and service on behalf of the people of Israel that is being done in the temple. So it's an act of service, it's an act of dedication, it's an act of work. So that's for the temple, but it is done in chapter 7, or in chapter 7 in verse 51. So was ended all the work that King Solomon made for the house of the Lord, and Solomon brought the things which David his father hath dedicated, even the silver and the gold and the vessels that he put among the treasures of the house of the Lord. So there is a treasury in the house of the Lord that had the treasures, but it also had whatever people were offering to the Lord. Now the Ark of the Covenant is brought, the Ark of the Covenant that sat in the Holy of Holies, covered which had an entrance, a veil, a very thick veil, very heavy veil that Josephus says it needed several oxen. Several oxen could put together, pulling at that veil couldn't tear it apart. It was that big and heavy and strong. But what I like about the Ark of the Covenant is that it had the two things. It had the staff of Aaron, which had that miracle happen to it. It grew sprouts, and it showed that Aaron was deserving of the priesthood. So it symbolized the priesthood of Aaron, and it also had the tablets, which had the covenant, which had the Ten Commandments. So, and this is the basis of the church. This is the basis of the religion. It's these things: the commandments, the scriptures, and the priesthood. And that's what's in the Ark of the Covenant that sits in the Holy of Holies, guarded by cherubs. So that is brought into the temple, and then we have the prayer of Solomon, the prayer of dedication of Solomon, and in verse 22 of chapter 8. And Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the congregation of Israel and spread forth his hands toward heaven. This is the traditional thing done usually by priests, but Solomon here is the one offering the dedication, not the priest, which is unusual, but he's Solomon, so he's going to do this. And he's had revelations from the Lord, he's had promises, so he's the one to do this. And he said, Lord God of Israel, there is no God like thee in heaven above or on earth beneath, who keepest covenant and mercy with thy servants that walk before thee with all their heart. I love this part. This is something that I try to remember every time I go to the temple. And in verse 27, but will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, the heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot contain thee. How much less this house that I have builded. So Solomon is always showing humility. The Temple of Solomon, based on the description, was a magnificent structure. It took lots of resources, tremendous amounts of wealth to build. And Solomon acknowledges we are nothing before the Lord. There is the whole earth, the whole universe cannot contain the Lord. So who are we before him? We're building this humble structure to you, Lord. So verse 28, yet have thou respect unto the prayer of thy servant, and to this supplication, O Lord my God, to hearken unto the cry, and to the prayer which thy servant prayeth before thee today. So that is his introduction to the prayer, and he basically launches into a prayer, and which is for the people of Israel. And when I was thinking about a theme that summarizes the prayer as far as the people of Israel are concerned is to turn. It asks the people of Israel to turn their hearts to the temple when they have sinned, when they have transgressed. That's where they need to turn, to the temple, and offer sacrifices. Nowadays, we're asked to turn our hearts to the temple, to participate in the temple, and to sacrifice our time, our effort, everything that we have. And it was asked of the people of Israel to offer sacrifices when they have sinned and turn their hearts to the temple. And but not only the people of Israel, but also to the strangers. So in verses 40 through 42, he says that they may fear thee all the days they live in the land which thou gavest unto our fathers. So this is about the people of Israel. Moreover, in verse 41, moreover, concerning a stranger that is not of thy people Israel, but cometh out of a far country for thy name's sake, for they shall hear of thy great name, and of thy strong hand, and of thy stretched out arm, when he shall come and pray towards this house. Now, it's interesting with this. I was reading this and I was thinking that Arabs, even after Islam, after the days of Muhammad, used to pray towards Jerusalem. They used to pray towards Beit al-Maqdesh, which is the holy the temple. They prayed towards the temple. There was no mosque at the time, but in the early days of Islam, they used to pray towards Beit al-Maqdesh, which is Jerusalem, which is the temple of Herod, Solomon, and all of that. And by the way, we're talking about the temple. The 17th of July is usually a very sacred day in the Jewish calendar, because it commemorates the destruction of the Temple of Solomon and the second temple by Antioch, by the Romans. So it's but that's another story. So there is this prayer for the strangers, and he invokes the Lord to hear the prayers of the strangers. So in verse 43 of chapter 8, hear thou in heaven thy dwelling place, and do according to all that the stranger calleth to thee, for that all people of the earth may know thy name, to fear thee, as do thy people Israel, and that they may know that this house which I have builded is called by thy name. So this is beautiful. Now, in verse 46 and 47, there is sort of a prophecy about the Jews. If they sin against thee, for there is no man that sinneth not, which is a nice acknowledgement, and thou be angry with them and deliver them to the enemy, which will happen to the Israelites, as we shall see, so that they carry them away captives unto the land of the enemy, far or near. Yet if they shall bethink themselves in the land whether they were carried captives, and repent and make supplication unto thee in the land of them that carried them captive, saying, we have sinned and have done perversely, we have committed wickedness, and so return unto thee with all their heart and with all their soul in the land of their enemies, which led them away captive, and pray unto thee toward their land which thou gavest unto their fathers, the city which thou hast chosen, and the house which I have built for thy name. Then hear thou their prayer and their supplication in heaven, thy dwelling place, and maintain their cause. So this is sort of a prophecy by Solomon. This is exactly what will happen. And the Jews will have to remember that, because their sins always they forget, and they have to be reminded, and they have to remember this. And that was a solution to their problem. If they repented, if they turned their hearts and minds and eyes towards the temple, if they turned their prayers towards the temple, remembered the principle of the temple, which is sacrifice, then the Lord would have returned them from the galut, from the diaspora, from the dispersion, from exile. And then verse 53 is the end of thy prayer, and again it remembers Moses, and it remembers the exodus from Egypt. And so the Lord be with us, and so Solomon thanks the Lord for the rest that he has given them, and invokes that he be with them, and he gives sacrifices. But I love in verse 60 of chapter 8 again, this verse, that all the people of the earth may know that the Lord is God, and that there is none else. So that's the purpose of the temple, that all the people. And this is something I argue a lot, that the covenant from the beginning, I mean, God has chosen Israel, he has chosen the sons of Jacob to be heirs of a covenant, to do sacrifices, to build the temple, to do all of this. The Messiah came from the Davidic line, but really the call has always been to all the world. It's nothing new. And these latter days, we're working towards gathering the whole world and fulfilling this part. And so in chapter 9, the Lord accepts prayers, he hears prayers. This is sort of a second revelation, a second communication between the Lord and Solomon. And in verse 3 of chapter 9 of 1 Kings, and the Lord said unto him, I have heard thy prayer and thy supplication that thou hast made before me. I have hallowed this house which thou hast built, to put my name there forever, and mine eyes and mine heart shall be there perpetually. So this has become a house of the Lord. And it's interesting to me that in the Temple of Solomon, there are two pillars that stood in the front. One of them is Boaz, which means with strength, and the other means the other pillar's name. The pillar's name is Yakin, which means he establishes. So he establishes with strength. That's and holiness to the Lord, of course, but he establishes with strength. And but here is what happens. So the temple is built. It's the pride and joy of Solomon, and he receives promises from the Lord. And of course, the building of the temple is expensive. There is a levy. There are taxes, taxes on the people that were subjugated by Solomon. Uh, Especially in verse 20 of chapter 9, it names those people, and all the people that were left of the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, which were not of the children of Israel. So these are the people who remain. There was a tribute of bond service on them to pay for the temple. But then there is all of these people of Israel. The people of Israel did not have to pay any taxes, but they worked as rulers and administrators and princes and military leaders. And this is basically the prophecy that Samuel has said to the Israelites when they chose to have a king. He said, "Your children will have that." But why is this mentioned? It's mentioned after the temple is being built, after they've achieved safety. There is this arm of the flesh, this reliance on the arm of the flesh. Solomon has the promises of the Lord that he, the Lord, will establish peace in Israel, but Solomon builds these massive armies and relies on the arm of the flesh, and then he goes into all of these building projects for safety. Of course, he's always offering burnt offerings and peace offerings to the Lord, in celebration of all of his accomplishments. But again, there is all of these trappings of power starting to appear. And chapter 10 is the visit of the Queen of Sheba, which I'll talk about in the next segment, the next episode. But Solomon is showing off his power. He receives these dignitaries and kings, and he brags about his knowledge, his power, and the record makes sure that it is mentioned. So power, it's the problem. And we will see in the next segment the decline of Solomon. And because he has so much wealth, so much power, he starts relying on it and thriving in it and forgets what matters. And that's the topic of the next segment. Thank you for watching.